Hey there, Kimmer here. Okay, here is your video that helps you understand how to read files with strings. Prior to this, we only read in data files that had all numeric data. So now we're going to show you how to use fgets when you're reading in files with strings. So this works if there's any string, even one string inside your data file. So let's go take a look. First, let's talk about what a CSV file is. It's real common to say CVS because our brains are used to that drugstore that's on practically every corner. So be careful. It's actually a .csv, not CVS. It stands for comma separated values. So if we take a look at this data file called data.csv, you'll notice that it has some data, a comma, some more data, a comma, and some more data per line. So let's assume that this is student data. The first thing you see is the student ID, the next thing you see is the student name, and then the third thing you see is their GPA. The biggest thing to understand is there are different data types. You'll notice that student ID here, student name, and GPA all are different data types. So I like this example because it's forcing us to use an integer for student ID, a string for student name, and a float for GPA. You'll see how these will interact in just a few minutes. But first, let's backtrack and let's try to remember those 5 steps for working with files. Step 1, be sure to create your file pointer. Step 2, attempt to open the file. Now you'll notice that in double quotes, the very first thing is the file name. Be careful, this is usually where students will put CVS instead of CSV, so watch that. The other thing too is we're going to use R because we are reading, and of course the fopen to be able to put it into our file pointer. Step 3 is we have to check to see if the file did not open. Remember, you check to see if your file pointer is equal to null, all caps, null. If so, tell them that there was trouble reading the file and you're terminating the program, which is where the exit comes in. The exit is in the include standard library, so don't forget to include your standard library. Step 4 is where we're going to be reading in our file. So we're going to come back to this point because that's going to be the longest thing. And then step 5, don't forget to close your file. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is, in reading your data file, we are going to create a giant string to hold one line of data. And what I mean by one line of data in this example is the student ID, the student name, and the GPA, the entire line. So you have to make sure that it's big enough. In this case, a line of 100 characters works for me. Make sure that your line works for whatever data type you're reading in. Okay, now we have something called the fgets, which you've seen before. Now remember, the fgets has 3 different parameters that we use. So we're going to use the fgets to grab one line of data. And remember, I always do this backwards. So you're going to use your file pointer as telling the fgets where to go to get the string from before we use standard input. Right now we're going to use our FP or file pointer. The next thing we're going to do is to tell it how many characters. This will stop either at the enter key or at, well, 99 characters, and then throw in the enter key as its line. Be sure that this number matches your character line that we were using. The last thing is tell it where you want it to go. Well, I want it to go, frankly, into this string called line. I like calling it line because that's what it represents, one giant line. So the last thing I like to do whenever I'm reading in our data file is to print it. Print the entire string. Can we see one line at a time? And that's what we're doing here. But don't forget, we have to put this into our while loop to continue as long as you're not at the end of file. Now an fgets actually returns a null when it gets to the end. So your while loop looks like this. While whatever is returned from fgets is not equal to null. So in other words, when I'm not at the end of the file, we're going to go ahead and continue. You'll notice that the entire line, commas included, are printing because the fget says, let's just go get the entire line. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Samantha Baydoun, the 3.4. And we're going to print that as is. So you'll see that that's what happens at this point. Next thing you need to do is you need to declare the individual variables needed for your data. In our example, we had a student ID, we had a name, and a GPA. So go ahead and declare those. The next thing we need to do, which we didn't get to talk a lot about, is something called a string pointer. Now, a string pointer will hold a tiny string. Actually, it doesn't have to be tiny, but in our case it will be. But it's going to hold a string and allow us to do things a little bit differently than we could if we were dealing with what we call a C string. Line is a C string. A line is 100 characters. A string pointer is a little more flexible than that. It allows us to make strings of variety of sizes, and it allows for assignment, which is something that we could not do with a C string. The next thing we're going to do, notice we're inside of our while loop, is use what we call the string token function. Now, you have to include the string.h file in order to use the string token function. So the string token function will take a look at your line. So you'll notice I have line here. And it will basically start at the beginning. That's what this part does. Start at the beginning and stop when you see this comma. Couple things I want you to note. Notice there are double quotes around this. Okay, it's wanting a string of what are called delimiters. Delimiters are basically things that you are telling the string token to look for so it knows where to stop. So in a comma separated values file, we're going to use our delimiter as a comma. So remember, we're starting at the beginning of our line, stopping when we're seeing a comma. And then we're going to take that chunk. I like calling it a chunk because it's a chunk of a string. Remember, line was the whole thing. This is just a small chunk. So it's going to take this small chunk and it's going to assign it to our string pointer. Something we couldn't do with a C string, but we can do with string pointers. Next, we're going to use what we call the a to I function to convert the string to an integer. A meaning character data or string, to I meaning integer. So right now our string pointer is an entire string. So if you remember, our data file had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is a string 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We need it to actually be an integer. So the a to I is going to take the string, convert it to an integer, and then of course we're going to assign it to our integer variable that we created. And I always like to print it. Because my thought is if I see it, if I can print it, then I can do anything I need to. And you'll see that there would be our output data if we were using that. It's always a good idea to take a look at your data file to see what's next in that line. So remember, I already handled the student ID. So up to the first comma. Next is the student name, up to the next comma. So now I have to deal with that. Again, I'm going to use the string token. Notice I'm still inside my while loop, and notice that it's underneath the first time I use the string token. This is the second time. Please note this looks different than the first. A lot of students get this wrong. Null. This is where you're going to be placing a null. I can tell you time after time, people end up putting line in here again. If you put line in here again, that means start at the beginning. But null, as an argument, basically says pick up where you left off to the next comma and take that chunk and put it into that string pointer again. So now it's just the string pointer that had the first chunk now is going to contain the second chunk. So this is tokenizing, or parsing out. There's a lot of different words that you're going to see in programming. Pulling out, chunking, all these little pieces separated with that comma. So right now we have name. And of course, name is already a string. And so we can use our string copy function just to take the one string and assign it to the next. But of course, I always like to test it to make sure that it works. So you'll notice that I added the string to my name, or a string for name, and I'm printing them. So now I've got those printing for test purposes. So you just keep continuing on as to doing what you would normally do. Use the string token again to grab the next chunk of data up until it sees the comma. Again, don't forget that you're putting null. If you put a line, it'll start at the beginning again. You do not want to do that. So we're going to go ahead and do that. assign it to our string pointer again. Now remember, this is GPA. So this time we're not going to use A to I. We're going to use A to F. F for a float. So it's going to convert the string 3.2 into a float 3.2, which we can then, you guessed it, assign to our GPA. And then, of course, I always print it. I want to make sure I can see it. If I can see it into those variables, then I can do anything that I would like to do. Additionally, we can do other things inside of our loop, such as add counters and accumulators. So for instance, here we can decide to figure out how many students we have in our file, because we might not know. And I can total up their GPA so that I can calculate an average. So we can use those inside of our while loop. Student counters, accumulators, those kinds of things. And you'll notice then outside of my while loop, I am printing the average GPA. I'm printing how many students. And here we go. This is our entire section 4. Step 4, actually. The biggest thing to understand here is how you chunk everything out. Always start at the beginning of the line, stop when you see the first comma, pull that chunk out into our string pointer. Then we have to do something with that string pointer. If it's an integer, you convert it using A to I. If it's a string, you simply copy it from one string to another. If it's a float, you convert it from a string to a float. But once you have them in those variables, such as student ID, name, and GPA, then you can do anything you want with them, including adding them to a structure or an array of structures. That's what we're going to have to do. So hopefully this will help you understand that when your data file includes a string, we're going to use the fgets method instead of the scanf method, which is what we did before. I hope this helps. Thanks.